what is the library required, and how do we set up the environment for application, how we can start working with React environment. So we saw one basic process, right? So today we will see how we can continue with that. So my React project, this is the project we created. And in this, we added a new file, index.html. And in this index.html, so we have integrated these scripts, embedded these scripts. 3 scripts are required. One, React Development JS. Another one, React DOM Development JS and Babel. These 3 CDNs you need to integrate, and we need to configure. Then we need to write the script, and the script used by React is JSX, and we have to configure as text JSX or text Babel type. And React DOM is going to create a virtual DOM. Into that virtual DOM, by using render method, it is going to render this paragraph, render the paragraph into this location, root location. Root is nothing but the ID given for the div inside body. It can be div or heading, anywhere, anything. We are just rendering that by using the DOM, right? Now, once we are aware of this basic process, how to configure and embed React into existing application, how do we can use React in existing application? Now we need to start building the React application. For that, first we are going to learn how to design the components, how do we work with the components and handle them, right? So let's see one simple example now. In React.js, so we have to understand how to deal with components. Just like components, there are 2 techniques actually to use Shubham, right? We have learned, we have seen 2 techniques. One is creating a separate React application. Second one is using React application in existing project. And when you are using in existing project, creating components have another technique. That's what we are going to learn today. You can create components in 2 ways actually. We can create the components embedded. We can create the components from external files. When you create component from external file, then you need to import React DOM and use it, right? So currently we are embedding. When you are embedding, then this is the technique you have to follow. That means we are not maintaining our component in a separate file. So we are designing the component in the page itself. We are designing component in the page itself and using it. When you are designing in the page itself and using, initially directly React DOM.render method is enough. Later we will see different methods of creating components and designing the components and using them. See, here directly we are rendering the content. Now tell me here which component we are rendering. Tell me here which component we are rendering. Which component we are rendering. Tell me which component we are rendering. Which component I am rendering in the current code. Which component I am rendering. Which component I am rendering? Paragraph. Am I right? I am rendering paragraph component. Understood? Yes. Where I am rendering the paragraph? I am rendering the paragraph into root. Am I right? So here the component is paragraph. Understood? Here the paragraph is component, right? So the paragraph is component and that component is rendered inside root. You can design any component and render inside root. You can design any component and render inside root. This type of component is called embedded component. Understood? This type of component is called embedded component. Embedded component. So this is embedded component. We are designing an embedded component and we are using embedded component. We are configuring and using embedded component. Now there is another technique here. So there is another technique here. Now we will design this paragraph is a component. I will create a function. And that function is suppose hello is a function. This hello function is returning. This hello function is returning some paragraph. Hello React.js. It is returning some paragraph hello React.js. Now I want to use this. And render this here. I want to render that here. Then we can access that hello function as a component. Here we can write hello as a component. Understood? We can write a hello as a component. We can use that component. That means now we are defining the component. We are defining the component separately. And we are using that component and rendering that component into our page. We are rendering the component into our page. So configuring and rendering the component into our page. We are defining the components into the page. So actually what happens now is when you run this, your component is designed and configured and we are accessing and you can see hello React.js. Now obviously I don't need this paragraph, right? Just only hello React.js. Then it is going to get that and you can design that option here. So components can be defined in several ways, which we are going to discuss now. We are going to learn and we are going to understand those components and handle them. Initially, so React components, observe carefully. React component can be defined. I will just give a detail here note. So I will show you a simple point here. Right. So I will give here React components. React components. Actually, components are components are building blocks for React application. React application. React application. So a component comprises of markup, styles, and logic. So we generally call this as JSX. It comprises of all these three, comprises of markup, styles, and logic. A component comprises of all these three. So a component is rendered into index page, is rendered into index page, is rendered into index page. So React is a single page application. That means there will be only one page and user will start. That means there will be one page to start and user will stay on that page and gets access to everything onto that page. So a component is designed and it is rendered. Actually, you can design components. You can design components. You can design components. So in two ways. One is embedded, and another one is explicit, external. You can design components in two ways, embedded and external. That means generally in embedded technique, so in embedded technique, the component is designed and directly rendered into virtual DOM, actually. Syntax, it will be like this. That means what we have to do, the basic syntax is nothing but directly we have to use the option. So script type is equal to text JSX, and here we need to define React DOM dot render method, and in the render method, React DOM dot render method, what you have to do is, so here you need to configure. Here we need to configure. So here we need to design. So here you need to design your component. Design your component. And after that, comma, you have to render into the location. Where to render? That means document dot get element by ID, render into the root location inside the body. This is actually embedded technique. I will close the script here. Yes, close the script here. This is embedded technique. In embedded technique, the component is designed directly and it is used in our page. It is rendered into our page. For that, we have to use DOM.render. We have to use DOM.render. React DOM.render method. By using the method, we can render that and we can configure. This is one technique. You can design component externally. That means in external technique, the component is designed separately. Component is designed separately and rendered into virtual DOM and rendered into virtual DOM. Now comes a interesting part here is generally when you are designing component, externally, external technique means component is designed separately and rendered into virtual DOM. And the components which are designed externally, the components which are designed externally are classified into two types. The components which are designed externally are classified into two types. We have functional components, we have class components. Two types of components will be there: functional components and class components. Two types of components will be there. Functional components are actually designed by using, so functional, they are by using functions. Functional components are designed by using functions. So class components are designed by using class. I will show you both points we will see now. That means functional components and how we can design the class components, how we can create the functional and class components. That means a component can be designed as a function or a component can be designed as a class. Then the first thing we need to understand is what is difference between a class and what is class and function. So because if you know about the difference, then we can use according to the situation. We can use the components. Let's see how we can design the functional components and so previous technique was directly designing the component. So you can design any complex component and render it. Any complex component you can design and render. So just like paragraph, you can design anything. If you want to design separately, then two options are provided for you. One is function, another one is class. Let's create one example. Let's see. This is a functional component. In the functional component, actually, what we have done is we created a simple function. We configured a simple function. And in the function, we are defining some functionality, returning some functionality, and render that into this DOM, into the virtual DOM. We are defining in this way. So how we can work with the functional components? Let's see. I will give an example now. Let's see. Actually, functional components in React.js. So functional components. So these components, the components designed by using JavaScript functions are known as functional components. We call them as functional components. They are known as functional components. Every functional component is by default. Every functional component is by default anonymous type in memory. What is an anonymous type? We already know. Anonymous type. So generally, anonymous function requires a reference name. It requires a reference name to access. So generally, what we do is we can simply define like this syntactically. How you generally define So we can just use a constant. So constant some f1 is equal to function. We have to configure like this. You know functional, you know anonymous, how to configure that. Now you can render this functional component. You can render the functional component by using so by component into virtual dome by using react dome dot render method and syntax is nothing but generally we have to use react dome dot render. We have to render that function f1. We have to write like an element, and where to render. So document dot get element by id, and we have to render into the root. This is how we need to configure. The functional components are defined in this way, right? So DOM allows only an element. That's the reason functional component is configured as an element. So generally, when you are creating your own components, remember one very important point. Some key points you need to remember. The custom components, these are our own components. The custom components must not collide with HTML DOM elements. That means they should not have the same name. For example, don't create a function by name P. Why? Because already there is a P element in HTML. Don't create by A, because already anchor element is there. So use any new reference name. It should not collide with HTML element names, right? That is important. Secondly, always you have to follow Pascal case or lowercase in naming. Pascal case means every word first letter must be caps, or lowercase. Don't use any another case, right? Pascal case is suggested mostly. Every word first letter must be caps. So let's see how we can handle this, how we can configure and how we can handle this, right? How to define and work with that. Let's create a functional component and see now. I will give the code completely again new. See, observe now. So all the libraries are embedded, okay? And we want to render into this root location. Then first we need to design a component in JSX. How to design the component? So we are creating a function. So generally we can define like this. Suppose const. So it is a constant. I will define the name as suppose title text. That is the name defined. And it is a function. Then you write the function in the way you know. That means any way you can define. Directly you can write the function, or you can store in a constant reference and you can use it. What is the advantage of storing in a constant reference is you can access any number of times and you can use it. Now you use lambda expression, or you write a general function string, anything your wish. You can define anything, whatever you want, right? Actually, what we are doing here, so we can use lambda expression. That means function implies. So what functionality it should return? So it should return some heading. So welcome to React.js. That is how you have to define and close that heading. So this is a function. This is a function called title text. Title text is a function. So this title text function is returning this functionality. And you can write with whatever JavaScript function knowledge you have. So right, I am using simple technique like this. Okay, now we need to render this. into the virtual DOM, then we have to use React DOM dot render method, React DOM dot render method. So this React DOM dot render method will accept which component you want to render. The component you have to write here, title text component. Remember, every component is a self-ending. That means there cannot be void components, void elements. So that means every component must be having an end tag, Then if it is not having an end tag, at least you use self-ending. So if you don't use self-ending, it will not work. So it is mandatory that every component you define, it should be self-ending. And where to render this component? Document dot get element by ID, and it should render into root location. It should define render into the root location. So that is how we are configuring. So that is ready now. That means React DOM dot render. So what to render? Title. And where to render? So this is the location to render. That's what we are configuring. Just for your clarity, I am giving like this. Now save this. This content should be rendered into this root element, and it should be displayed into the root element. You can configure and render into the root element. Now I will save here and refresh, and you can see that it says welcome to React. This is a basic example of how you can create a functional component and how we can access the component and use it. So how do we configure the component and use the component? So initially, this is one example of creating a functional component. So title text is a component and it is rendering this information and we are accessing. I will copy that and I will paste it for your reference. This is an example. Okay. Now, another important is I will paste that entire code here. Okay. This is an example. Now, another technique is generally, if I want a component to be easily extended, if I want a component to be easily used in my application, actually what we have to do is we can design, means if you want reusability, extensibility, we can design components in separate files. We can design components separate use in our index page. That means it's not mandatory that you have to design. You have to design the component inside the page only. So that means without embedded technique. So what you can do is, so you can configure component in external file and integrate into HTML page. You can configure component in external file and integrate into HTML page. You can do that. You can configure and integrate into HTML page. Now the key point here is how you can manage this. So how we can handle that. Let's see another example. So I will remove from here. Now it is empty, nothing is there. Let's create a new folder in our project. I will create a new folder. Folder name SRC. SRC is the folder. Not mandatory, but generally we maintain our coding in a separate file called SRC, separate folder called SRC. In that SRC folder, we will create a new file called app.js. App.js is the file. In this file, you can create your component. So I am creating constant. So here I will write as a title text. So we have title text. Title text is equal to, so I defined some user login. Okay. And we will create another constant login is equal to, here we need to define a function. This function have to return, so this function have to return a markup. It should return a markup. If it have to return a markup, generally how we design the markup, then in order to design the markup, you have to put a parenthesis. In the parenthesis, we will create a div, and in the div, so we design all the markup we want to return. That means I will create a heading. The heading text will come from this variable. How to embed any dynamic content? Generally in Angular, you have seen we use double parenthesis. In JavaScript, we use double curly brace, right? And here we use embedded expression. In React, the expressions are embedded by using just a curly brace. And you can get that title text and display the title text here. Now below that, I am creating a login screen, data term and username, and the data definition input type is equal to text, and data definition input type is equal to password. Okay, we are designing that. Remember, as per the standards, every element that you design in JSX should have an ending element. That reason you can put an ending element like this, or you can use slash. That means that indicates that it is self-ending, that is defined. Now here I am adding, so after the data list we have a button and say login. That's done. We are configuring that and we are using it. Now another option here now is we configured this and save. Now this is our component. We separately designed the component. Now this must be rendered into the DOM. It must be rendered into the DOM. So what we can do here, we can write, so React DOM dot should render the component. It should render? The component is login. Login is the component, comma, where it should render. So document get element by ID. In root we have to render. This is how we need to configure. Now in this technique, we are designing our component in a separate file called app.js. And here I am using the functional component. I am designing a functional component. And its reference name is login. It is the reference name login, and we are configuring that here. So now we need to use this in our index page. So in the index page, we have to link that script source is equal to, so it is coming from /src/app.js, and the script type is equal to text.jsx. That is mandatory. So that means we are getting that script from another location and we are using that script here. And you can see that now the login screen is ready. That means we created a login component and we are adding that login component into this location. So there can be multiple components. There can be a component nested with another. So you can use different types of components. Now important is you can also use Bootstrap. You can also use the styles, effects, styles, colors and effects, class names, and you can make the appearance better for this. Generally, Suppose I want to use Bootstrap for this component. So Bootstrap for this component. Now observe carefully. So in order to use Bootstrap for the component, what we have to do is generally we go to index page. In index page, we can link Bootstrap. Already we downloaded Bootstrap for our project. So we can use CDN or we can link that. So I'm using link relation is equal to style sheet. So style sheet and href is equal to / modules bootstrap this CSS, then bootstrap.css. We are adding Bootstrap here. Now, if Bootstrap is added into your index page, the appearance will change. Now, how to apply the classes of Bootstrap for our React component? Generally, what you have to do is go to the component file. In the component file here, if you want to apply some effects, then what you have to do is generally HTML contains class, but you know that the property is not class, the property is class name. So you want to apply here. So then for text box, we have to use the property class name. Class name is equal to, we will give the class name as form control. You should not use class, you should use class name, because class is static and class name is dynamic property. You need to bind to property. So class name is equal to form control. And for button, we are using the class name is equal to BTN and BTN primary. And that is the basic. And you can see it gets that appearance. And here the render, you see the div, we are using the class name as container. Then it will give the appearance in a perfect way. I'm just using here the class name as BTN block, and it will get that appearance and it will display. This is designing a component and configuring the component and using the component in our page. So this is a functional component, how we can design a functional component and use. There can be multiple functional components, there can be nested components. We will see all the techniques, we will understand. First, once we are good with designing the component. So it is ready now. So generally the components are configured here and the components are defined here. Okay. Now after configuring the components and defining the components, so what you need to do now is you need to learn another component, a class component. What is difference between class and functional? I will tell you. Those are the differences, right? This is one technique. So we designed the component. Let me give you the example for this. First point, add a new folder, and the folder is SRC. Okay, then add a new file into SRC folder, into SRC. So, and that file is app.js. In app.js, we need to, so this is all inside app.js. We need to create the presentation in this way. We need to create the presentation in this way. So that is constant, so that's login, and we are configuring in this way. Okay. Now we need to link this app.js in our index page. App.js into our index page. Generally, so in index.html, we need to just link as text.jsx. It is mandatory. That means now link to your HTML, right? So, and here we need to put this code index.html code to link that app.js, and you have to keep that app.js. When designing the component for rendering, some basic rules are present. Observe carefully. Generally, when you are rendering any content, make sure that the content is enclosed. Generally, only one paragraph we are rendering, welcome. And you can see that paragraph welcome is rendered. I want to render another paragraph, another hello. It is not allowed. How to render multiple? To render multiple, you have to enclose this. If there are multiple lines to render, you have to into a container. In the container, we can add those and we can present. So individually, multiple lines not supported. You have to put everything in a container. But sometimes this will create a problem. Why this will create a problem sometimes? Because usually what happens is, if you create a div unnecessarily and add that div into table or into another element, it will have a lot of disturbance in the alignments and placements. Lot of disturbance will be there. That's the reason, if you don't want to really render this div because it is affecting, then you can use an empty element like this. That's how we write. This is good technique. Why? Because when you are writing multiple lines, when you are configuring and writing lines, so usually multiple lines are not allowed directly. And if you put a container unnecessarily, then usually what happens is that container so will add into the DOM and create problems in the alignments. Then better what you can do is, so you can configure an empty element. So empty element should start with the empty parenthesis and configure that an empty parenthesis, right? So one more option, what I told you, this is okay. That means it is working fine. One more important option I told you, that the JSX will not allow void element syntax. Suppose you are rendering a picture. So if you are rendering another element, then we can just use an ending element for that and configure ending element. For example, I will show you one simple option like, right? So for example, suppose I want to display some picture and configure some picture. So here, this is an empty element and I want to use an image. Let's keep here in the public folder. I will create a new folder. Into that images folder, I will add an image. That means reveal some images. I added an image here, some shoe. I will copy that and paste it here. I want to image. Then here we are declaring a constant. Shoe is equal to, it is in images /shoe.jpg. That is the path. And I want to use that in the image. That means here I am, so Nike casuals. By default, it is rendering that Nike casuals. And that I want image. Generally, IMG is empty. So you write IMG, you can see that an end tag will be generated. And I am removing that. It is invalid. You need a self-ending. It's mandatory that it should have self-ending. And the source is equal to dynamically. It is coming from shoe variable. So we are configuring the width is equal to 100 and height is equal to 100. Like this we are defining. and it has to get that and display from that. So dynamically we are adding the elements. So every element that you render in JSX must have an ending tag, or you have to define self-ending. Otherwise it is invalid. Individual lines are not supported. You have to use container. All contents must be inside the container. And container can be any container. If you don't want to really generate the container, then you can use this empty angle braces and configure them. Empty angle braces and configure them. That's how generally we design the contents, the functional components, how we can add them. Now, next important, we need to understand how to create nested elements, functional nested elements, how we can create nested elements, how we can design the nested elements. So that we will see in next session. Tomorrow we will discuss about that. Tomorrow we will see how we can configure the class-based functional components and work with them, right? Functional and class components. In functional, some more options are there that we'll see in the next session.